Jake Martinez stood at the entrance of the Arcturus Galactic Academy and felt very small. The building stretched up into the purple sky like a mountain made of glass and metal. Ships from different planets landed and took off every few minutes, carrying students who looked nothing like humans. He pulled his bag closer to his shoulder and walked through the main doors. The lobby was huge, with a ceiling so high he could barely see the top. Students filled the space, but Jake had never seen beings like these before. Some looked like walking crystals that sparkled in the light. Others seemed to be made of glowing gas that floated instead of walking. A few looked like giant insects with too many eyes and legs that clicked on the floor. Jake looked down at his simple human clothes and wondered what he was doing here. Back on Earth, his teachers had called him smart. His grades were good, and he understood science better than most kids his age. But here, surrounded by beings from advanced civilizations across the galaxy, he felt like a child trying to play with adults. A voice spoke behind him. "You must be the human exchange student." Jake turned around and saw something that made his eyes go wide. The creature standing there was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it was made of silver metal. It had 4 arms and eyes that glowed blue. This was an Andromedan, one of the oldest and wisest species in the galaxy. "Yes, sir," Jake said, trying not to stare. "I'm Jake Martinez from Earth. I am Professor Kelyon. I will be your physics instructor." The professor's voice sounded like music, with tones that went up and down in ways human voices could not. "Come, let me show you to your classmates." They walked through halls filled with floating screens that showed information in languages Jake could not read. Students moved past them, some walking, some floating, some moving in ways that seemed impossible. Jake tried not to bump into anyone as he followed the professor. They entered a classroom with seats arranged in a circle. 3 other students were already there, and Jake knew these would be his study partners for the semester. Each one represented their species' best and brightest young minds. The first student looked like a person made entirely of clear blue crystal. Light seemed to dance inside her body, creating patterns that hurt Jake's eyes if he looked too long. She sat perfectly still, but Jake could somehow tell she was thinking very fast about very complicated things. "This is Kithara," Professor Kelyon sighed. "She is from Zephyr 7. The Zephyrians have minds that work like the most advanced computers. Kithara can solve mathematical problems that would take our best machines hours to figure out." Kithara's crystal head turned toward Jake. When she spoke, her voice sounded like wind chimes. "Greetings, human. I have calculated 47,382 different ways this conversation might proceed. The probability of successful academic collaboration is 67.3%. Jake blinked. Nice to meet you too." The second student was harder to look at because he was not really solid. He looked like a cloud of purple and gold gas that had somehow learned to hold a shape like a person. He floated a few inches above his chair, and Jake could see the wall through his body. "This is Vorthik from the Nebula colonies," the professor explained. "The Nebulans can control energy with their thoughts. They built their cities in the hearts of stars and traveled by riding solar winds across space." Vorthik's voice sounded like it came from very far away. "Human child, I sense the electromagnetic field around your primitive nervous system. Your brain produces such simple electrical patterns. How curious." Jake felt his cheeks get red. "Yeah, we humans are pretty basic, I guess." The third student made Jake take a step back. It looked like a giant praying mantis, but with 6 arms instead of 2, and compound eyes that seemed to look in all directions at once. Its green shell was covered in patterns that shifted and changed as Jake watched. "And this is Zix-9 of the Chitauri Collective," Professor Kelyon said. "The Chitauri process information faster than any known species. They can think about thousands of different things at the same time without getting confused. Zix-9's voice came from somewhere inside its throat and sounded like several people talking at once. Human specimen detected. Analyzing speech patterns, body language, and scent markers. Assessment. Simple biological entity with limited processing capability. Query. Why was this primitive being selected for advanced studies? Jake's face got even redder. He was starting to understand why Earth had only been allowed to send one student to the academy. Compared to these beings, humans really did seem primitive. Professor Kellyanne seemed to notice Jake's embarrassment. Each species brings unique perspectives to learning. That is why we gather students from across the galaxy. He moved to the center of the circle. And speaking of unique perspectives, I have an announcement about your final examination. All the students focused on the professor. Even Jake forgot his embarrassment as he listened. This semester, you will face the ice maze of Corvala Prime. Professor Kellyanne said, it is one of the most challenging tests in the known galaxy. For over 500 years, students have traveled to that frozen moon to prove their worth. Kithara's crystal body started glowing brighter. I have read about this challenge. The maze is carved from a glacier, and its walls move according to complex mathematical patterns. Success requires advanced calculation skills. Vortex gaseous. Form swirled with excitement. The ice contains rare minerals that respond to energy manipulation. I will need to study thermal dynamics and electromagnetic properties. Zix-9's many eyes moved independently as it processed information. Maze navigation requires optimal pathfinding algorithms. I will design 3,847 different route strategies and select the most efficient approach. Jake listened to his classmates discuss advanced theories and complicated plans. He felt more out of place than ever. What could a human possibly contribute to solving a challenge that required such advanced thinking? Professor Kellyanne continued, the maze has tested the greatest minds in galactic history. Some students solve it in hours. Others never find their way out. It requires more than intelligence. It demands adaptation, creativity, and the ability to think in ways that pure logic cannot teach. After class, Jake walked slowly back to his dormitory room. He passed groups of alien students discussing quantum mechanics and interdimensional physics. Their conversations sounded like gibberish to him, full of concepts that Earth science had barely begun to understand. In his room, Jake sat on his bed and looked out the window at the alien landscape. 3 moons hung in the purple sky, and he could see the lights of spacecraft traveling between them. He thought about home, about the frozen ponds in Minnesota, where he had learned to ice skate as a child. Ice skating was probably the only thing Jake was really good at. He had started when he was 5 years old, learning to glide across the frozen lakes near his house. By the time he was 10, he could move across ice like he was dancing. He knew how ice felt under his feet, how it responded to pressure and temperature, how it could be smooth or rough, depending on the weather. But what good would ice skating do him in an advanced galactic academy? His alien classmates could calculate complex mathematics, manipulate energy, and process thousands of thoughts at once. Jake could skate backwards and do a decent hockey stop. The comparison was almost funny, except it made him feel so useless. He opened his computer and started writing an email to his parents back on Earth. He wanted to tell them he was thinking about coming home, that maybe he was not ready for this kind of challenge. But as he started typing, he stopped. His father had always told him that every person had something special to offer, even if they could not see it themselves. His mother had taught him that sometimes the simplest solutions were the best ones. Maybe they were wrong, but Jake decided to stay and try his best. After all, he had come further than any human before him. He owed it to Earth to at least attempt the ice maze of Corvala Prime. Even if he failed, At least he would know he had tried. Outside his window, alien ships continued their journey across the star-filled sky, carrying beings whose minds could grasp concepts that humans were only beginning to discover. But somewhere in space, there was also a frozen moon with an ancient maze that had challenged the greatest intellects in the galaxy. Jake Martinez from Minnesota was about to find out. If a human who knew how to ice skate could teach the universe something new. The transport ship shook as it entered the atmosphere of Corvala Prime. Jake pressed his face to the small window and watched the frozen world below. Everything was white and blue, covered in ice that sparkled like diamonds in the pale sunlight. Mountains of snow stretched as far as he could see, and the wind howled so loud he could hear it through the ship's thick walls. "Temperature outside is -40 degrees, announced the ship's computer. "All students must wear environmental suits to survive." Jake looked around at his classmates. They were all preparing for the challenge in their own ways. Kithara sat motionless, her crystal body glowing as she ran calculations in her head. Numbers and equations seemed to dance in the light patterns inside her. Vorthik floated near the ceiling, his gaseous form swirling with different colors as he practiced controlling energy. Zix9 stood in the corner, all 6 of his arms moving. As he drew complex diagrams on multiple screens at once, Professor Kellyon moved through the ship, checking each student's equipment. When he reached Jake, the human was just sitting quietly, staring out at the ice below. "Are you not preparing like the others?" the professor asked. Jake shrugged. "I don't really know how to prepare for something like this. I'm not good at math, like Kithara, or energy stuff like Vorthak, or planning like Zix9. The professor's glowing eyes studied Jake for a moment. Sometimes the best preparation is simply being ready to learn. The ship landed with a bump that made everyone hold on to something. The doors opened with a hiss, and bitter cold air rushed in. Even through their environmental suits, Jake could feel how deadly the temperature was. Without protection, they would freeze solid in minutes. They walked across the landing platform toward a massive structure that rose from the ice, like a frozen castle. The ice maze of Corvala Prime was even more impressive in person than in the pictures Jake had seen. Walls of blue ice stretched up 30 feet high, so smooth they looked like glass. The maze seemed to go on forever, with passages that twisted and turned in patterns that hurt to look at. "Incredible," Kithara whispered, her electronic voice full of wonder. "The geometric complexity is beyond anything I calculated." Vorthik's gaseous form sparkled with excitement. "I can sense energy patterns in the ice structure. There are minerals I have never encountered before." Zix9's compound eyes moved in different directions as he tried to see the entire maze at once. Mapping incomplete. The structure appears to extend beyond visual range. This will require more processing power than initially estimated. Professor Kellyon led them to the entrance, where ancient symbols were carved into an archway of ice. "These markings are older than most civilizations," he explained. "They tell the story of the first beings who learned to navigate ice caves on this moon, long before space travel existed." Jake stared at the symbols. They looked like people sliding and dancing on ice, their arms spread for balance. Something about the pictures reminded him of skating, but he kept that thought to himself. "The rules are simple," Professor Kellyon continued. "Each of you must enter the maze alone. You cannot communicate with each other once inside. The goal is to reach the center where an ancient artifact waits. Some students complete the challenge in a few hours. Others never find their way out." He paused and looked at each student carefully. "But remember, this maze is not just a test of intelligence. It is a test of understanding. The builders created something that responds to how you think, how you approach problems, how you see the world." Kithara stepped forward first. "I will begin the challenge." Her crystal body reflected the blue light of the ice walls as she walked toward the entrance. My calculations indicate optimal pathfinding strategies. I will map every turn and measure every angle. She disappeared into the maze, her footsteps echoing off the ice walls. Through a viewing screen back at the entrance, they could watch her. Progress. Kithara moved carefully, stopping at every corner to take measurements. She used instruments to calculate distances and angles, creating a perfect map as she went. For the first few minutes, everything went well. Kithara made steady progress, her mathematical approach working exactly as planned. But then something strange happened. The walls of the maze began to move. It started slowly, like watching plants grow. The ice walls shifted and flowed, creating new passages while closing others. Kithara stopped walking and stared as her carefully calculated map became useless. She tried to recalculate, but the walls kept changing faster than she could measure them. "This is impossible," she said, her voice coming through the communication system. "The movements follow no logical pattern. How can I calculate a path when the maze changes constantly?" Soon Kithara was trapped in a dead end that had not existed moments before. She stood there, surrounded by walls of ice, trying desperately to find a mathematical solution to a problem that seemed to have no mathematical answer. Vorthik entered the maze next, floating confidently above the ground. "I will succeed where pure mathematics failed," he announced. "I will use energy to reshape the ice and create my own path." His gaseous form glowed brighter as he gathered power. He sent waves of heat toward the ice walls, trying to melt openings where he needed them. But the ice did not respond the way normal ice should. Instead of melting, it seemed to absorb his energy and become even harder. "The mineral composition is more complex than I anticipated," Vorthik said, his voice strained from the effort. "The ice contains elements that resist energy manipulation. My powers are useless here." Like Kithara, Vorthik soon found himself lost. The maze seemed to sense his attempts to force his way through and responded by creating even more confusing passages. His usual confidence faded as he realized his energy powers could not solve this challenge. Zix9 was the third to enter. His many legs clicked on the ice as he moved with mechanical precision. "I will succeed through superior data processing," he declared. "I will analyze every possible path and select the optimal route." His compound eyes recorded everything, processing millions of details every second. He mapped wall thickness, ice density, and passage width. He calculated probability matrices for every possible turn. His mind worked like the most advanced computer ever built, but the maze seemed to defy logic itself. Passages that should connect did not. Walls appeared where his calculations said they could not exist. The more data Zix9 processed, the more confused he became. "Error, error," he muttered, his voice becoming distorted. "Data inconsistency detected. Logic systems overloading. This maze violates fundamental principles of structure and design." Soon all three alien students were trapped in different parts of the maze, each defeated by their own approach. Kithara could not calculate a solution to walls that changed without pattern. Vorthik could not force his way through ice that absorbed his energy. Zix9 could not process data. It made no logical sense. Jake watched all of this through the viewing screens. He saw his brilliant classmates struggle with a challenge that should have been easy for minds like theirs. These beings could solve problems that would take human scientists centuries to understand. They had built civilizations that spanned star systems and created technology that seemed like magic. But here they were, stuck in a maze made of simple ice. Professor Kelyon stood beside Jake, observing the failures with interest rather than disappointment. "Fascinating," the professor murmured. "Each species approaches the challenge exactly as I expected. Mathematics, energy manipulation, logical processing. All valid approaches, but perhaps not complete ones. Jake looked up at the tall alien. What do you mean? The maze was not built by mathematicians or energy manipulators or computers, Professor Kellyanne explained. It was built by beings who understood ice in a different way. They lived on this frozen moon for thousands of years before space travel. They learned to work with ice, not against it. Jake thought about the ancient symbols at the entrance, the pictures of beings sliding across ice with their arms spread for balance. He thought about the frozen ponds back home in Minnesota, where he had spent countless hours learning to read ice like a language. Your turn, human, Professor Kellyanne said gently. Jake walked to the entrance of the maze. Through the communication system, he could hear his classmates still struggling in their separate prisons of ice. They were calling out calculations, energy readings, and logical analysis. All their advanced thinking was getting them nowhere. Jake put his hand on the ice wall at the entrance. Even through his environmental suit, he could feel something his classmates had missed. The ice was not just cold, hard material. It had texture, personality, life. It reminded him of every frozen pond he had ever skated on. He stepped into the maze and immediately did something that probably looked crazy to anyone watching. Instead of walking carefully like the others, Jake pushed off gently with one foot and started to glide. The ice beneath his feet felt familiar, like coming home after a long trip. Jake had learned to skate before he could properly ride a bicycle. He knew ice the way birds knew air or fish knew water. He did not need to calculate its properties or manipulate its energy or process its data. He just needed to listen to what it was telling him. As Jake glided deeper into the maze, the walls began their strange dance around him. Jake glided through the first turn of the maze and felt something he had not expected. Joy. Pure, simple joy, like he used to feel on Saturday mornings when he would wake up to find the pond behind his house perfectly frozen, waiting for him to explore. The ice beneath his feet was not the enemy his classmates thought it was. It was smooth and welcoming, like every skating rink he had ever loved. Jake pushed off with his right foot and let momentum carry him around a corner, his body automatically leaning into the turn the way he had done thousands of times before. Through the communication system, he could hear his classmates still struggling in their separate parts of the maze. Kithara was reciting mathematical formulas, trying to find patterns in the wall movements. Vorthek was attempting different energy frequencies, hoping to find one that would affect the special ice. ZIX9 was processing data faster and faster, his electronic voice becoming more frantic as logical solutions failed him. But Jake was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about the winter when he was 8 years old, when his dad had taken him to a natural ice cave in northern Minnesota. The walls had been smooth like glass, and his dad had shown him how to read the signs that told him where the ice was thick and where it might be thin. Ice talks to you if you know how to listen, his dad had said. It tells you stories about the weather, about the water underneath, about how long it has been frozen. You just have to pay attention. Jake was paying attention now. As he moved deeper into the maze, he began to understand things his brilliant classmates had missed. The walls were not moving randomly. They were responding to pressure changes, temperature shifts, and vibrations in ways that followed rules older than mathematics. When Jake approached the section where the passage was about to close, he could feel it in the way the ice hummed under his feet. The vibration was different, like the warning sounds a frozen pond makes when someone walks on thin ice. So instead of trying to force his way through like Vorthek would, or calculating when it might reopen like Kithara would, Jake simply changed direction and found another path. The maze seemed to sense his different approach. Where it had created impossible barriers for the others, it offered Jake gentle curves and smooth passages. When a wall began to shift, blocking his way, Jake did not fight it. Instead, he pivoted on his skates and flowed in a new direction, trusting that the ice would guide him where he needed to go. Back at the entrance, Professor Kelyan watched Jake's progress with growing amazement. In all his years of teaching, he had never seen a student navigate the maze like this. Where others saw obstacles, the human saw opportunities. Where others found chaos, the human found rhythm. Impossible, Kithra's voice crackled through the speakers. She had been watching Jake's movement on her suit's display screen. He is not following any logical pathfinding algorithm. His route makes no mathematical sense. His energy patterns are completely inefficient, Vothek added, his gaseous form swirling with confusion in his own section of the maze. He is wasting motion with those sliding movements. Why does he not simply melt through the walls? Zix-9's compound eyes processed Jake's movement data and found it deeply disturbing. The human's approach violates optimal navigation principles. He is taking longer routes when shorter ones are available. He is moving in curves when straight lines would be more efficient. Yet somehow, he progresses while we remain trapped. Jake could hear his classmates discussing his methods, but their words seemed to come from a different world. They were trying to understand ice the way their species understood everything else, through advanced thinking and complex analysis. But Jake understood ice the way his ancestors had understood rivers and winds and the movement of animals. Not through thinking, but through feeling. He came to a section where the passage split into 3 directions. Each path looked identical to mathematical analysis, but Jake could sense differences his instruments would never detect. The left passage felt cold and still, like ice that had been frozen for a very long time. The right passage had a subtle vibration that reminded him of ice beginning to crack. But the middle passage hummed with the gentle frequency of fresh ice. Strong and welcoming. Jake chose the middle path without hesitation, gliding forward with growing confidence. Behind him, the other 2 passages sealed themselves shut, confirming what his instincts had told him. As he moved deeper into the maze, Jake began to understand why the ancient builders had created this challenge. It was not really about intelligence or advanced abilities. It was about connection. The beings who had first lived on this frozen moon had developed a relationship with ice that went beyond science. They had learned to dance with it instead of fighting it. Jake thought about all the times he had skated on natural ice back home. Every pond and lake had its own personality. Some ice was friendly and forgiving, perfect for beginners. Other ice was challenging and demanding, requiring skill and respect. But ice was never truly hostile, unless you tried to force it to be something it was not. The maze ice was like that too. It responded to how you approached it. When his classmates had tried to dominate it with mathematics, energy, and logic, it had become defensive and confusing. But when Jake approached it with respect and partnership, it became cooperative and helpful. He reached a section where the walls were moving in a complex pattern that would have driven Zix-9's processors to overload. But Jake did not try to analyze the pattern. Instead, he watched it the way he used to watch waves on a lake, looking for the rhythm underneath the apparent chaos. There it was. A gentle pulse, like a heartbeat or the breathing of something alive. Jake timed his movements to match that rhythm, skating forward when the walls expanded and pausing when they contracted. It was like dancing with a partner who knew all the steps if you were willing to follow their lead. The communication system crackled with new sounds. His classmates had stopped their frantic calculating and energy manipulation. They were listening to Jake's approach, trying to understand how a simple human was succeeding where their advanced minds had failed. Jake, Kithra's voice came through the speakers, and for the first time since he had met her, she sounded uncertain rather than confident. How are you reading the wall movements? I detect no mathematical pattern. Jake paused in his skating and tried to put his feelings into words his classmates could understand. I am not reading patterns, he said slowly. I am listening to the ice. It is like music, but you feel it instead of hearing it. Music? Vorthic's confusion was obvious in his electronic voice. Ice does not produce audio frequencies. Not that kind of music, Jake explained, pushing off again and gliding around. A curve that opened just as he approached it. The kind you feel in your body. Like when you dance, you do not think about each step. You just move with the rhythm. Zix9's voice was full of processing strain. This makes no logical sense. Ice is frozen water with specific molecular properties. It cannot have rhythm or music or personality. Jake smiled inside his environmental suit. His classmates were still trying to understand ice the way their species understood everything, by breaking it down into parts and analyzing each piece. But ice, like skating, was more than the sum of its parts. He came to a section where the passage opened into a wider chamber. The walls here moved in slow, sweeping motions that reminded Jake of the way northern lights danced across winter skies. Instead of trying to predict where the walls would be, Jake simply flowed with their movement, letting them guide his path like a river guides a boat. The joy he felt was growing stronger with each turn. This was what he had been missing at the academy, the simple pleasure of doing something he truly understood. His classmates might be able to calculate faster than computers and manipulate energy with their thoughts, but Jake could read ice like a language he had been born to speak that as he skated deeper into the heart of the maze. Jake realized something important. The challenge was not really about reaching the center first or proving who was smartest. It was about finding your own way to connect with something ancient and beautiful. The maze was teaching them all different lessons. If they were willing to learn, Jake Martinez from Minnesota was finally home, even though he was millions of miles from Earth, skating on ice that had been waiting for someone who understood its voice. Jake glided through the final passage and emerged into the heart of the ice maze. The center chamber was beautiful beyond anything he had ever seen. The walls curved up into a dome of perfect blue ice that seemed to glow from within. Patterns of light danced across the surface like the northern lights he remembered from home. In the middle of the chamber sat an ancient artifact on a pedestal of carved ice. It was a sculpture made from the same blue crystal as the walls, showing figures that looked like they were skating or dancing on ice. Their arms were spread for balance, and their faces showed the same joy Jake felt when he moved across frozen water. Jake skated slowly around the pedestal, studying the artifact. These were the first beings who had lived on this frozen moon, the ones who had learned to work with ice instead of fighting it. They had built this maze not as a test of intelligence, but as a celebration of understanding. The sculpture seemed to recognize his presence. It began to glow brighter, and Jake could hear a sound like distant wind chimes. He reached out to touch it, then stopped. Something was wrong. Not with the artifact, but with what was happening outside this chamber. Through the communication system, Jake could still hear his classmates. Kithara was trapped in a section where the walls had closed around her, leaving only a small space barely big enough for her crystal body. She was running calculation after calculation, but each one led to the same result. No mathematical solution existed for her situation. Vorthik was stuck in a passage where the ice absorbed every form of energy he tried to use. His gaseous body was growing dimmer as he exhausted himself trying to force his way through barriers that would not yield to power. Zix9 was the most distressed of all. His logical mind was overloading as he processed contradictory data about passages that should exist but did not, walls that moved in ways that violated physics, and routes that led nowhere despite perfect planning. Jake looked at the beautiful artifact and felt troubled. Yes, He had reached the center first. Yes, he had succeeded where his brilliant classmates had failed. But what did that really mean? These beings had taught him so much during their time at the academy. They had shared their knowledge freely, never making him feel stupid for asking simple questions about concepts that were basic to them. Kithara had helped him understand advanced mathematics by breaking complex formulas into smaller parts he could grasp. Vorthik had shown him how energy moved through space, using simple demonstrations that made difficult physics seem almost magical. Zix9 had taught him how to process information more efficiently, even though Jake's human brain could never match. Chitauri's speed. They had been generous with their knowledge and patient with his limitations. Now they were trapped and frustrated while he stood in the chamber they had all worked to reach. It did not feel like victory. It felt like leaving friends behind. Jake made a decision that probably broke the rules of the challenge. Instead of claiming the artifact and declaring himself the winner, he activated his suit's communication system and reached out to his struggling classmates. "Kithara," he said softly, "can you hear me?" Her voice came back strained and tired. "Jake, you have reached the center already?" "Impossible. My calculations showed it would take at least 6 more hours to navigate the remaining passages." "I am here," Jake confirmed. "But I need to tell you something. Stop trying to calculate the ice movements. Instead, try to feel them." "Feel them?" Kithara's confusion was obvious. Ice does not generate emotional responses. It is simply frozen water with measurable properties. Jake thought about how to explain skating to someone who had never experienced it. When you walk, do you calculate every step? Do you measure the distance and angle before you move your legs? Of course not. Walking is automatic muscular response, based on balance and coordination. The ice is like that too, Jake said. It has balance and coordination, but you have to stop thinking about it and start feeling it. Your crystal body can probably sense vibrations better than mine can. Try listening for the rhythm instead of looking for the pattern. There was silence for a moment. Then Kithara's voice came back, different somehow. "I detect ... frequency variations. Very subtle, almost like music," Jake finished. "Now move with it. Do not fight it or try to predict it. Just flow with it." Through the viewing system, Jake watched as Kithara began to move differently. Instead of calculating each step, she started swaying gently, her crystal body picking up vibrations that her instruments had been too crude to detect. The walls around her began to respond, opening passages that had been sealed moments before. "This is remarkable," Kithara whispered. "The mathematical patterns exist, but they are emotional mathematics. They follow rules of harmony, rather than geometry." Jake smiled and switched to Vorthik's frequency. "Vorthik, are you listening?" The Nebulan's voice was weak from exhaustion. "I hear you, human friend, but I do not understand how you succeeded. This ice resists all energy manipulation. You are trying to force your energy into the ice," Jake explained. "But ice does not like to be forced. Try working with it instead. Feel where it wants your energy to go, then help it get there." "Impossible. Energy follows physical laws, not preferences." Jake thought about the way ice responded to temperature and pressure. When you skate on thin ice, you do not stomp down hard. You glide gently, spreading your weight so the ice can support you. Try spreading your energy the same way. Vorthik was quiet for a long time, and his voice returned with wonder. "The ice. It has currents. Energy currents like solar winds, but much more subtle. If I follow them instead of fighting them." Jake watched as Vorthik's gaseous form began to flow differently through his section of the maze. Instead of pushing against the ice, he began moving with its natural energy patterns. The walls that had absorbed his power now seemed to welcome it, using his energy to create new passages that led toward the center. Finally, Jake contacted Zix9, The Chitari's voice was distorted with processing strain. Jake human, my logic systems are failing. This maze violates fundamental principles of structural engineering and spatial relationships. I cannot compute a solution to impossible data. Jake understood Zix9's problem better than the others. The Chitari's mind was like the most advanced computer ever built, but sometimes the best solution was not the most logical one. Zix9, what if the maze is not trying to be logical? Jake asked, what if it is trying to be emotional? Emotions are not computable. They serve no logical function. But they serve other functions, Jake said gently. They help you understand things that logic cannot measure. Try processing the maze data as emotional information instead of logical information. I do not know how to do that. Jake thought about his own experience learning to skate. When I was little, my mom taught me something. She said that sometimes the heart knows things the brain cannot figure out. Maybe try listening to your heart data instead of your brain data. There was a long pause. When Zix9 spoke again, his voice was different. Softer, somehow, I am detecting patterns that are not logical, but are somehow correct. The maze structure follows emotional coherence rather than physical coherence. Now move with those patterns instead of against them. Jake watched through the communication system as all three of his classmates began to make progress toward the center. They were learning to approach the maze the way he had, not as a problem to be solved, but as a partner to be understood. Fathara discovered that her crystal body could resonate with the ice's frequency, creating a harmony that opened passages, like music opening hearts. Vorthek learned to dance with the energy currents in the ice, his gaseous form flowing like aurora through frozen space. Zix9 began processing emotional data alongside logical data, finding solutions that satisfied both heart and mind. One by one, they emerged into the central chamber where Jake waited. Their approaches had been different from his, but they had all learned the same lesson, that understanding was more powerful than domination, cooperation more effective than force. The ancient artifact glowed brighter as all four students gathered around it. The sculpture seemed to recognize that something special had happened here, something the maze builders had hoped for, but rarely seen. Jake looked at his classmates, no longer feeling inadequate or out of place. He had something valuable to offer after all, and they had been willing to learn from him, just as he had learned from them. The ice maze had taught them all that there were many kinds of intelligence, many ways of understanding the universe. Sometimes, the most advanced solution was also the most natural one. The four students stood together in the heart of the ice maze, each having arrived by their own path, but guided by shared understanding. The ancient artifact glowed brighter than before, its blue light dancing across the dome-shaped walls like captured starlight. Jake could feel something special happening, something that went beyond simply completing a test. Kithara's crystal body sparkled with new patterns of light, differing from the rigid mathematical displays she usually showed. I have never experienced anything like this, she said, her wind chime voice filled with wonder. My calculations were correct, but they were incomplete. The ice responds to emotional frequencies as well as physical ones. Vorthek's gaseous form swirled with colors Jake had never seen before, warm golds and gentle purples that seemed to match the feeling of friendship. My people always believed that energy manipulation required dominance over matter, he said, thoughtfully. But cooperation with matter creates possibilities I never imagined. Zix9's compound eyes moved in patterns that seemed less mechanical than before, more like the way organic beings looked around when they were truly seeing instead of just recording. Processing emotional data alongside logical data has increased my problem-solving efficiency by 847%, he announced. But more importantly, it has taught me that efficiency is not the only measure of success. Jake smiled at his friends, feeling proud but also humble. You all taught me so much at the academy. I just shared what I knew about ice. We all learned together. Professor Kellyan's voice suddenly echoed through the chamber, filled with something. That sounded like amazement. In 500 years of testing, no group of students has ever reached the center together. The ice maze was designed to find individual excellence, but you have discovered something far more valuable. The professor's image appeared on a viewing screen that materialized from the ice wall. His forearms were spread wide in what Jake had learned was an Andromedan gesture of great respect. You have rediscovered the true lesson of the maze builders. They did not create this challenge to separate the brilliant from the average. They created it to teach that every perspective has value, and that understanding grows when different minds work together. Jake looked around at his classmates and realized what had really happened here. They had not just solved a puzzle or completed a test. They had learned to see the universe through each other's eyes. Kithara had discovered that mathematics could be beautiful as well as accurate, that numbers could dance and sing when viewed with an open heart. Her rigid calculations had become fluid poetry, more powerful because they included feeling as well as logic. Vorthik had learned that true strength came not from forcing energy to obey his will, but from understanding how energy wanted to flow and helping it find its path. His power had become gentler, but far more effective. Zix9 had found that processing emotional information alongside logical data did not make him weaker or less efficient. Instead, it made him more complete, able to understand problems that pure logic could never solve. And Jake had learned that being human was not a limitation to be ashamed of, but a gift to be shared. His simple, intuitive understanding of ice had unlocked solutions that the most advanced minds in the galaxy could not reach alone. The ancient artifact began to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats. As it did, Jake felt a connection to the beings who had built this maze thousands of years ago. They had been simple creatures living on a frozen moon, but they had understood something about cooperation and understanding that even advanced spacefaring civilizations had forgotten. The artifact is responding to your unity, Professor Kellyan explained. It was designed to recognize when students truly learn to work together, not just alongside each other. The sculpture lifted gently from its pedestal and began to glow, so brightly that Jake had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the artifact had changed. It now showed 4 figures instead of the original ice dancers: a crystal being, a gaseous form, an insectoid creature, and a human, all moving together in perfect harmony across a surface of ice. You have become part of its story, the professor said softly. Your names will be remembered along with the ancient ice dancers who first learned these lessons. As they prepared to leave the maze, Jake noticed that the walls no longer seemed threatening or chaotic. The ice had become friendly, opening clear paths back to the entrance. The maze seemed to recognize that they understood its message and was welcoming them to leave as honored guests, rather than conquered challengers. They walked together through passages that had been obstacles just hours before. Kithara moved with fluid grace, her crystal form resonating with the ice's natural frequency. Vorthik flowed like a gentle breeze, his energy harmonizing with the currents in the frozen walls. Zix9 clicked along with a rhythm that matched the sea. Ice's subtle pulse, his logical mind now balanced with emotional understanding. Jake skated beside them, no longer feeling different or out of place. He was part of a team that combined the best of 4 different ways of thinking. Together, they were stronger than any of them could be alone. When they emerged from the maze, the frozen landscape of Korvala Prime looked different somehow. Howling winds seemed like music, and the endless ice fields looked like a canvas waiting for new stories to be written across its surface. Back at the academy, word of their achievements spread quickly. Students and professors from across the galaxy came to hear about the group that had solved the ice maze together. But more importantly, they wanted to understand how different species could learn from each other in ways that made everyone stronger. Jake, Kithara, Vorthik, and Zix9 became the most famous study group in the Academy's history. Their collaborative projects attracted attention from researchers throughout known space. They approached every challenge by combining mathematical precision, energy manipulation, logical processing, and intuitive understanding. When they studied stellar formation, Kithara's calculations guided them to the right star systems, vortex. Energy senses told them how the stars actually behaved. Zix9's processing power helped them understand the data, and Jake's intuitive insights revealed patterns that pure analysis missed. When they researched alien ecosystems, each brought their unique perspective to understanding how life adapted to different environments. Their reports became required reading at universities across the galaxy. But the most important thing they learned was not academic. They learned that friendship could bridge any gap between species, that cooperation was more powerful than competition, and that everyone had something valuable to teach if others were willing to learn. Jake's final report on his exchange experience became legendary at the Academy. He wrote about how the ice maze had taught him that being human was not about being the smartest or the strongest or the most advanced. It was about being able to see familiar patterns in unfamiliar places, too. Find common ground between different ways of thinking, and to trust in the wisdom that came from simple experience. Every species brings their own gifts to the universe, Jake wrote. Humans might not have the most sophisticated technology or the highest intelligence, but we have something equally important, the ability to connect with others and find solutions that none of us could discover alone. The ice skating rinks back on Earth never looked the same to Jake after his return. Every time he glided across frozen water, he remembered the lesson of the maze, that the most advanced solution was sometimes the most natural one, and that the best way forward was often to trust in the wisdom gained from simple joys shared with friends. The ice maze of Kovala Prime had become more than just a test. It had become a symbol of what could happen when different beings worked together with respect, understanding, and trust. And somewhere in the frozen heart of that ancient labyrinth, the artifact continued to glow, waiting for the next group of students, brave enough to learn that unity was stronger than any individual brilliance. Years later, when Jake became a professor himself, he would tell his students about 4 friends who learned to skate together across the ice of understanding, and how that dance had changed their view of the universe forever.